When my parents raised my rent to teach me a lesson, I felt betrayed. It felt personal and cruel. I'd paid on time for years, and still they punished me. I stared at the new number like a verdict. They expected me to beg. They had no idea what was coming next. Pain hit like a slam of a door. I got the text while making dinner, the numbers cruel and exact. I felt small and sharp inside. I'm Claire Adams, 32, a paralegal in Columbus, Ohio. I share a small house with my mom and dad. My name is on the lease, my credit is steady, and my job keeps me afloat. My parents are Gail and Martin, both in their late 50s. They raised their voices, then raised my rent. Gail is proud, quick to judge. Martin hides behind a dry joke when he's nervous. They told me it was to teach me responsibility. It felt like punishment for asking for help with the mortgage years ago. My paycheck is steady but really tight. I juggle student loans and car payments. My job is safe, but my housing is not. They changed the amount and the due date in a text and expected obedience. I stared at the screen until my hands shook. At work the next morning, I forced a smile. The office smelled of coffee and paper. My supervisor, Janice, noticed the strain in my voice. She asked if I was okay. I lied and said yes. I couldn't tell her my parents had weaponized rent. I didn't want pity. A little bell rang in me, a cold, steady reminder that I could lose my home or my dignity. I left work early, heart loud in my chest. They had no idea what was coming next. I spent the night counting numbers and breathing slow. The rent increase was more than a note, it was a public shift. Our neighbors already whispered about money and choices. My name on the lease made it mine to defend. I thought about moving out, but rent in my city had jumped too. My savings covered 2 months, not the new amount. Gail and Martin acted like I was a child. They lectured about standing on my own. I remembered lending them money 3 years ago when Dad lost work. They never repaid me. They didn't mention it now. The unfairness landed sharp. My work at the law firm gave me access to knowledge. I watched client files and numbers. At night, I scrolled legal forms and tenant rights until my eyes blurred. There are rules about rent changes. You can't change a lease midterm without notice. You can't evict without cause. I kept this to myself. I wasn't ready to fight. I worked during the day and planned at night. Small signs began to appear. Gail accidentally left a bank statement open on the kitchen counter, a mailed notice in her recycling. I noticed the pattern of sloppy paper trails. I saved copies of texts and photos of the notice. I started to document everything. Documentation feels boring until you need it. I told myself to be calm. Anger flares and fades. Strategy lasts. I whispered into my pillow that they had no idea what was coming next. The next weeks turned colder. The increase became enforcement. They moved the due date earlier and threatened fines. I found a letter slipped under my door one morning. Pay or face late fees. My chest tightened. The house felt smaller. My boss announced layoffs at the firm. I watched colleagues pack boxes. Fear crept back. I worked extra hours to stay safe. At a community meeting, a neighbor mentioned landlords raising rents to encourage children to move. People murmured agreement. It hurt like salt. My parents started telling friends I was irresponsible. Martin joked about me living off them. Gail warned relatives I was young and naive. They began to take my mail, saying they were helping. I discovered a bank alert showing a withdrawal linked to Dad. I asked and he shrugged. That's when betrayal did its real damage. They used my dependence and family gossip to isolate me. Their story was louder than mine. I felt cut off. My phone felt heavier. I confided in one coworker, Laura, 30, blunt and trustworthy. She listened without judgment. Laura offered to review my records and point me to local tenant aid. She was cautious but fierce. I also reached out to the firm's HR for advice about documenting disputes and protecting my employment. Threats became public whispers and legal lines blurred. I learned that proving misconduct needed more than feelings. It needed precise papers. I promised myself to move from wounded to prepared. The plan started to take shape in small, deliberate steps. They had no idea what was coming next. Things escalated into humiliation. Gail started posting photos of family dinners on social media with captions about teaching my grown daughter responsibility. Relatives commented, pity turning into judgment. People assumed I had done something wrong. My friends asked if I was okay.
Elite.
My shame kept me quiet. At work, a client called asking for references, and I blurted my home stress. Gossip crossed the thin lines between personal and professional. It threatened my reputation. My parents began withholding shared utility bills, telling me they'd handle it. Then a week later, the power bill was unpaid and my name showed as responsible on a late notice. A notice from the bank arrived, an overdraft tied to an electronic payment I didn't authorize. I realized someone had access to my account numbers. Panic flared. I felt betrayed in every corner. Family, bank, job. My life looked shaky. I started to meet with Laura in person, mapping a timeline. She suggested talking to a tenant rights counselor and a local attorney who handled family financial disputes. The attorney, Mr. Green, was practical, late 40s, methodical. He asked for documents. Paperwork wins, he said. He outlined realistic legal steps, cease and desist letters, proof of unauthorized account access, and if needed, small claims or civil actions. I heard the path forward sound like a route out of fog. It wasn't dramatic. It was methodical and slow. I felt steadier. I also planted 2 small lies of my own. I pretended to be more vulnerable to lure them into making careless moves. The trap relied on their arrogance. They had no idea what was coming next. Planning began quietly. I kept working full days and doing small, controlled moves at night. I kept a notebook locked in my bag and photographed every notice and text. Laura created a secure email chain to save copies of evidence. She taught me to screenshot bank alerts and to forward suspicious messages to my attorney. Together, we made a folder that would tell a clear story. I met Mr. Green twice. He explained the law in plain terms. If someone accessed my accounts without consent, we could file for conversion and seek restitution. If they interfered with my mail, there were statutes for mail tampering. Green recommended we start with a firm but formal approach, a cease and desist letter demanding proof of authority to change lease terms and immediate return of any funds taken. It also asked for an accounting of repayments they owed me. We planned to involve the bank if digital transfers were traced to my parents. Banks take unauthorized transfers seriously when presented with clear documentation. That step would create a paper trail the court could see. I also began to bolster my financial position. I tightened budgeting, increased bill payments, and opened a separate account strictly for rent and savings. I informed my landlord, quietly, that I would continue paying the original agreed amount pending formal notice. One ally surprised me. My neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, mid-50s, steady, who had seen parts of the family's behavior. He offered to be a witness about delivery notices and odd mail habits. We prepared a calm, organized case. Revenge, I told myself, would be legal and precise. They had no idea what was coming next. With evidence collected, we moved to formal warnings. Green drafted the cease and desist and a demand for accounting. I signed the papers with hands that felt steadier than my voice. We hand-delivered the letter and kept copies. Gail read it and scoffed. Martin tossed it on the counter. I stayed silent. The letter demanded they stop changing the lease, return any funds taken without authorization, and preserve all financial records. A week passed. They responded with denial and blame. They accused me of exaggerating. Their lawyer's name was not on any documents. That worked in our favor. They had no formal proof. Green then wrote to the bank with notarized statements alleging unauthorized withdrawals. The bank placed temporary holds and opened an internal investigation. The freeze showed up on Dad's account activity reports. Social pressure rose as relatives started asking questions about the letter. A cousin called Gail, with concern. The narrative began to shift. What looked like discipline now read as potential theft. We filed a small claims action for the amounts taken and for emotional distress tied to documented tampering. The filing was sober and exact. We attached screenshots, copies of notices, and a ledger of payments I had made previously. Lara organized witnesses. Mr. Alvarez swore he had seen a mailed notice in the family recycling. The bank's preliminary findings favored our claim. I felt an odd calm. The work was mundane but powerful. They thought they could scare me into silence. They had no idea what was coming next. Execution felt like paperwork and a nervous throat clearing. The hearing day arrived, and the courtroom was small and plain. My palms were steady when I entered. Gail stared with a face that tried to be composed. Martin avoided my eyes. We presented the ledger first. Green spoke calmly, presenting copies of texts, mailed notices, and bank alerts traced to Dad's card. The judge listened with quiet attention. The bank's investigator testified that transfers were flagged and that some withdrawals lacked proper authorization. My neighbor and Lara both gave statements about mail and observed behavior. Evidence is a blunt instrument. It doesn't need drama. It needs clarity. The judge asked pointed questions about consent and notice. Martin stammered when asked about the changed lease date and where the notice had come from. Gail tried to say it was a family matter. The judge reminded everyone that legal rights don't disappear because you share a home. The ruling favored me. The court ordered repayment of the unauthorized amounts, a correction to the lease record, and a small judgment for emotional distress. But the most important consequence was reputational. The family meeting afterward shifted. Relatives who had called Gail to scold now asked for apologies. There was awkwardness at Sunday dinners and forced civility. Following the court order, the bank corrected the records. My landlord accepted my continued payments at the original rate pending proper process. I felt relief wash over me. The victory was clean and quiet, the way I'd planned. They had no idea what was coming next. The aftermath settled into an odd peace. I kept my job and paid the corrected rent. Gail and Martin repaid the amounts as ordered, grudgingly and in parts. They apologized in ways that sounded rehearsed. My relationships changed. Some relatives offered support, others stayed distant. The house felt both familiar and different. I was no longer merely their daughter. I was someone who could hold them accountable. Emotionally, I found a quieter strength. I still felt the ache of betrayal, but it was tempered by knowledge and boundaries. I closed the separate account with stronger savings and a new lease agreement that only I signed. The bank offered additional fraud protections. At work, gossip faded. Janice gave me a small raise for taking on extra caseloads during layoffs. Lara and Mr. Alvarez remained friends. Mr. Green sent a note that said justice is often boring but necessary. I learned a hard lesson about pride and power. My parents thought punishment would teach me humility. Instead, I taught myself to stand up and use the systems in place for people like me. I don't gloat. I don't need to. The quiet accountability changed the family dynamic. They learned a lesson about boundaries, and I learned what it means to protect myself. Sitting alone that evening, I looked at the old kitchen table where the first notice had been left. I felt tired, but steady. They had finally seen the consequence of their choice. I felt a calm I hadn't expected. The end wasn't dramatic, just honest.